seabream, blacktail seabream, and how catch and release impacts that species.
Cool, thanks Kino for the introduction. Yeah. So in terms of South Africa's marine recreational fishery sector, it is the largest both economically and participatory, generating 9.7 billion rand per year, with approximately 480,000 to 560,000 participants. There are also 400,000 marine shore-based anglers, and therefore the sector often outcompetes the other fishery sectors. Problems associated with this sector is overexploitation in the form of excessive harvest, as well as poor governance in the form of lack of monitoring. Bag limits, size limits, and closed seasons exist to monitor mandatory catch and release fishing within the sector. It is important to know the effects of and the implementation of regulations within the recreational fishing to obtain better management strategies and conservation efforts. There are a range of species-specific regulations that exist. Mandatory catch and release is inevitable when trying to catch a specific species of a specific size, and the effects of fish health on fish health and survival are unknown for many of these species. General patterns do exist when identifying the effects of catch and release. For example, hooks can cause tissue damage, fighting a fish can cause physical exhaustion, fish handling can cause an increase in air exposure duration, as well as scale and slime loss, which can lead to disease and fungal development. And essentially these effects can be compounded to create a worsened condition for an individual. The effects on fish health and survival as a result needs to be investigated to understand total biomass removal from the sector. In terms of what's been done before, competitive angling data was used on bronze bream, and estuarine angling data was used on cob and Cape stumpnose. And my methods followed the methods of these papers to make comparable results. The peak physiological stress response delay was also identified for cob and bronze bream and is known to be species specific, creating a knowledge gap to fill that for many of the unknown species. That brings me to my species, Diplodus capensis. It is abundant and considered to be least concern. It is a resident temperate species inhabiting rocky shores and turbulent seas. It is a slow-growing species and can be aged up to 21 years with a 50% sexual maturity of 3 to 4 years of age. They can attain 47 centimeters and achieve a weight of 2.7 kilograms. And they are often dominantly targeted by marine recreational fishermen. They have a bag limit of 5 per person per day, with a minimum size limit of 20 centimeters. They have no closed season and are considered to be a no-sale recreational species. The aim of this project was to quantify health and survival of blacktail to catch and release event in South African marine shore-based fisheries, and to improve the fish handling practices and guidelines. This was achieved by firstly quantifying recreational catch and release handling practices, using that information then to find the time course and peak stress response for the species, and to assess secondary response, motor response, and short-term survival to a catch and release event for the species. All that the data collection took place from Fish River Mouth to Port Elizabeth, as this was identified as a CPUE hotspot for Diplodus capensis. To determine the health and survival after a catch and release event, it is vital to first know the handling practices of public marine shore-based fishery competitive, non-competitive marine shore-based fishery anglers. Angler observations were then used to determine this peak stress response delay period, and all that information was used to conduct a field experiment testing the effects of catch and release on blacktail. For the angler observations themselves, it was basically from when the angler set the hook until they caught the fish and released it. All observations were studied covertly, and there was no interaction with any of the anglers. Fight time, handling time, air exposure were recorded, as well as the estimated species and size, and any other poor handling practices were mentioned. For the lab component, determining the time course and peak stress response, 36 blacktail were housed in the aquatic ecophysiology research platform laboratories in these two holding tanks over here. Essentially all the individuals were given 3 weeks of acclimation, where then they were subjected to a simulated catch and release event, which used the mean air exposure and mean fight time from the angler observations. There were essentially 6 treatments, being 0, 30, 60, 90, 120, and 150 minutes of time after the simulated catch and release event, essentially having 6 fish per treatment group. Then, essentially blood glucose and blood lactate were measured, drawn with a 21 gauge needle using point of contact devices. For the field experiment, it was an on-field experiment where 83 blacktail were caught over multiple sessions and were kept in these 3,500 liter tanks, essentially having 27, 28 blacktail per tank, and each of these tanks represented an air exposure treatment, being the minimum, average, and maximum air exposure treatment from the angle observations. In terms of the fishing, it was done in a pairing system, so as soon as someone would hook a blacktail, then their buddy would record the fight time and help them assist with landing the fish, keeping air exposure to a minimum of 3 seconds as they placed the fish into a bucket of water. The fish was then unhooked underneath the water, where unhooking difficulty, bleeding, hook placement, hook size, and type were all noted. The fish was then exposed to air exposure, and the time of day was noted, where they were then subject to a reflex action mortality predictor assessment, RAMP. This included the head complex, tail grab, equilibrium, and body flex test. Thereafter, blood was drawn at the peak stress, and they were placed back into the holding tank for a minimum of 16-hour observation, where the next morning the RAMP assessments were repeated, the length and condition of the fish were noted, and the healthy fish were released, and the fish was considered to be a mortality if it had lost its equilibrium at that stage. In terms of what we found, overall, from the angler observations, there were 13 species, giving rise to 50 catch and release events and 75 catch and keep events, with 24 blacktail events. The average fight time was 45 seconds, and the average air exposure was 84 seconds. This was similar to competitive angling data in 2015, which was 44-second fight time and 80-second air exposure. The quickest release found was 11 seconds in a Cape Stumpnose, and the longest release was 224 seconds in a blacktail. This was very similar to the estuarine angling data found on cob, which had a minimum of 10, average of 75, and maximum of 240 seconds. In terms of the lab, there was an estimated peak blood lactate concentration at 59 minutes, modeled using a GAM, where after 150 minutes, most of the individuals had returned to that baseline value. Similarly, there was a peak blood glucose concentration at 64 minutes, where again, quite a lot of the individuals had returned to that baseline value. In terms of the field experiment, no catch and release variables significantly affected blood chemistry. As you can see here, air exposure duration did not significantly affect blood glucose, as well as blood lactate. However, there was a bit of a trend, but it was still not significant, p equals 0.06. Then in terms of the RAMP assessments, 89% of the individuals demonstrated some form of impairment. Variables that did not affect impairment were J or circle hooks, unhooking difficulty, although it was a predictor for impairment, hook placement, apart from swallowing the hook, and barbed and barbless hooks, although barbless hooks did notably produce less bleeding occurrences than that of barbed hooks. Bleeding affected the overall accumulated RAM score directly after a catch and release event, as well as fight time. And the average fight time was notably in the field the same as that of the angler observations. However, air exposure played the biggest role in impairment. So if you look here, you can see that there was no significant difference between the tail grab and the body flex tests, and notably very high fail rate amongst the body flex test. But if you look at individuals exposed to 15 seconds of air, they had a 7% chance of failing the equilibrium and head complex test. But individuals exposed to the 225 air exposure category had a 35% chance of failing the head complex test and a 54% chance of failing the equilibrium test. Air exposure also affected the accumulated RAM score directly after a catch and release, and so did length, where you can see that larger individuals had a higher chance of failing the tail grab test than that of smaller individuals, as well as for the equilibrium test, where larger individuals had a 4.7 times higher chance of failing the equilibrium test. The length also affected the accumulated RAM score directly after a catch and release event, as well as 16 hours later, where you can see here larger individuals definitely had higher RAM scores than that of smaller individuals. In terms of mortalities, there was one absolute mortality where this individual was exposed to 225 seconds of air and had swallowed the hook. There were also 4 inferred mortalities where the condition of the fish was too poor to release them back into the ocean. From these 4, 2 of them were exposed to 15 seconds of air and both of them had swallowed the hooks, and 2 of them exposed to 80 seconds of air and the cause of death was unknown. Then, in terms of what this means, angler behavior demonstrated to be very similar across estuarine, competitive, and public marine shore-based angling behavior. Some anglers demonstrate a keenness to practice good catch and release, while other anglers do not care to minimize poor handling practices, and only 54% of the fish caught were actually released. In terms of extracting blood for blacktail at the peak stress response, it is recommended that it be at 60 minutes with a range of 50 to 70 minutes. Stress response is species specific and was 30 to 40 minutes in cob, 50 to 75 minutes in bronze bream, where 65 minutes was used in the field. Peak stress can therefore be similar amongst the same family of fishes or size of fishes, or potentially amongst fishes occupying the same habitat and consuming similar food types. Then, in terms of sorry, it's just, yeah. Okay, originally this project tried to incorporate delayed blood sampling. However, no catch and release variables significantly affected blood glucose, blood lactate concentrations. This shows that individuals approach that baseline value quicker than others, and future studies should do it before or after the peak, before you can get some build up of blood glucose, blood lactate, and after you could get some individuals that have hindered recovery. However, ramp assessment was a better assessment for stress. The 2 most important variables was that of air exposure and the size of the fish. Larger individuals should be treated more carefully as smaller fish seem to be more resilient to catch and release. Air exposure is terrible and needs to be minimalized at all costs. It increased the failure rate in the head complex and equilibrium test, which is considered to be a more sinister outcome physiologically compared to that of the body flex and tail grab test. It also increased physical exhaustion, worsened the condition of the fish, compromised respiration and roll stability. Here you can see in this individual, this was exposed to 225 seconds of air like many of the others. As soon as you'd put them back into the tank, they would lie on the bottom of the tank. They've lost equilibrium, were breathing very erratically, and were just physically tired. So if you were to release an individual like this directly after catching it, yeah, it's in a high energy surf zone, so it could get washed back up onto shore, could get washed into rocks, or could be so physically tired that it will not deal with a predator encounter well. Then, okay, although challenging to minimize, fight time should also be minimized as it created physical exhaustion in individuals. Bleeding also caused impairment, so it is recommended that barbless 1/0 circle hooks be used when trying to catch this species to reduce tissue damage and to reduce the amount of bleeding, also avoiding that, helping with predator avoidance by removing that olfactual trigger. Greater than one size 1/0 circles should also be avoided to increase the recovery chances for these individuals by removing that tissue damage aspect, and less than 1/0, smaller than 1/0 circle hooks should also be avoided to prevent hook swallowing. Hook swallowing resulted in mortalities where 3 out of 6 of the fish that died ended up swallowing the hooks. It is if you catch a fish, it's swallowed a hook, it's bleeding, it's badly wounded, especially in larger individuals, anglers should consider keeping their catch or putting it into a large body of water to allow it to recover. Essentially, anglers should absolutely use rock pools when fishing on the rocks and buckets of water when fishing in the surf, just to reduce that air exposure and handling time. And if possible, they should also take less photos, especially in larger individuals. And anglers should also consider using their own ramp assessments on their own catches to assess the physical condition of their own catch before releasing it. My final question to you is, your next catch is in your hands. What will you do? And then, yeah, I'd just like to acknowledge my supervisors, NRF and Care Zone projects for funding this, any and all the student assistants I got along the way, and DFFE. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thanks a lot, Michael. there's room for some questions. Yeah.
I appreciate, obviously, the coastline of South Africa, the temperature is probably fairly consistent. But was there any seasonality in your experiment? Because in the Seychelles, we know that water temperature can also be quite a big predictor on post-release mortality, but that's because the water there is very hot. Was that taken into account at all in your experiment?
Yeah, so water quality was continuously measured for both the lab experiment and the field experiment. The lab experiment took place in April, and I think the average water temperature was about 17.5. And then in the field, it was arranged between 16 and 19. So it was pretty standard, like very minimal variation, yeah.
Any more questions? Yeah.
Nice study done. Is there a different, so if you have air exposure, obviously is the single most important one, but if you have the same air time of exposure, but one fish undergoes more stress than the other, did you test that as well? For example, falls down or...
Yeah, I do think that on an individual level, certain individuals react better than others. But yeah, you just want to reduce as much air exposure as possible because it increases exponentially. Well, not exponentially, but very linearly, you know. So yeah, rather don't chance it and just try and practice good catch and release.
Can I maybe rephrase a little bit? For example, if you're tagging a fish, you also minimize the air exposure, but you're adding a stress level of inserting a tag. So does that play a role, or did you test it all a different type of stress level?
Well, we didn't tag any of these fish. So yeah, tagging and procedures like that will definitely impose stress on individuals. So that's why we did it in such a way that it was only one blood extraction on each individual to minimize imposing as much stress as possible. Yeah, to remove that as a confounding variable. Yeah.
Yes. Thanks a lot. Thank you. Very done. Applause to everyone. Yeah. So we've come to the end of this section. There will be more on catch and release tomorrow morning.